The televised feed concluded at 1 hour and 14 minutes. The events occurring at the 1 hour and 49-minute mark never reached the public airwaves, generating zero breaking headlines, lacking viral video snippets, and sparking no pundit roundtables attempting to rationalize the aftermath, leaving solely a crimson portfolio containing 47 restricted sheets and a succession of files that transformed a standard congressional inquiry into something infinitely more exact, substantially more perilous, and vastly more enduring. Furthermore, if you solely witnessed the publicly aired edition, you entirely overlooked the exact juncture when the official documentation ceased being manipulated and began dictating the fate of every individual present. Representative Meeks had guarded that specific binder since 8:51 earlier that morning, keeping it inverted and unbothered, placing it deliberately far enough away from his desk's border so it simply resembled routine documents pending review. He completely ignored the item throughout the initial introductory remarks. He intentionally avoided mentioning it during the primary verbal back and forth. He allowed the chamber to establish a comfortable cadence, falling into a routine that appeared recognizable, bureaucratic, and highly controllable, which is precisely the method used to construct a snare among seasoned professionals by projecting the illusion that no unexpected developments will occur. Pam Bondi entered the venue at 9:26 alongside 4 lawyers and 2 assistants. She repositioned her audio equipment, displaying the distinct self-assurance of an official who had previously navigated grueling Senate vetting processes alongside 12 months of relentless congressional probes. Her physical demeanor indicated she recognized this environment, her vocal delivery suggested intense prior coaching, and throughout the majority of the initial 60 minutes, that evaluation remained accurate because the inquiries directed toward her were entirely anticipated, carefully calibrated, wholly foreseeable, and easily addressed within the strict confines of judicial prudence and standard bureaucratic rhetoric. However, the genuinely consequential segment never occurred within that initial time frame. Approaching the 90-minute threshold, the media contingent had largely departed following customary routines. Their journalistic dispatches were drafted based upon early dialogue, entirely structured around their preconceived notions regarding the committee's true purpose. They possessed the required narrative angles, exactly as they consistently managed to secure. Yet on this specific occasion, their acquired content completely missed the true substance, largely because at the 1 hour and 49-minute interval, Representative Meeks ultimately grasped the hidden portfolio. He offered no vocal declaration, he provided zero indication of changing moods. He merely flipped the cover and revealed the contents. Furthermore, the materials he arranged on the physical desk before him represented far more than mere stationery. They embodied strategic progression, immaculate chronological pacing, and exhaustive groundwork delivered with absolute accuracy. The initial file he presented constituted a financial ledger detailing a calendar timestamp, a specific bank routing digit, and an approving autograph. These details lacked theatricality when viewed independently, lacking the inherent power to halt proceedings unilaterally, yet surrounding circumstances are precisely what transform raw metrics into actionable legal proof. The timestamp stamped on that ledger occurred exactly 11 days following the official secrecy directive directly linked to the Jeffrey Epstein dossiers. The banking digits connected to a financial profile that was completely non-existent just 18 months prior. Additionally, the penmanship resting on the approval section did not originate from a lifelong Justice Department bureaucrat adhering to conventional operational guidelines. That isolated fact inherently invites intense scrutiny, yet the congressman refrained from posing an inquiry immediately, knowing verbal probes are easily parried, and his strategy avoided mere evasion. He instead meticulously engineered a devastating factual paradox. He situated another piece of evidence across the surface, followed by a third, arranging them utilizing the specific measured distances born exclusively from extensive private practice. Every individual sheet was purposefully angled, ensuring any observer gazing from the primary testifying position recognized an emerging web of connections rather than isolated memos. This display lacked any chaotic spontaneity. It represented calculated staging. Subsequently, he locked eyes squarely with the Attorney General, delivering a five-word inquiry bearing exponentially greater gravity than its basic phrasing implied concerning who approved the financial movement. He delivered no grand monologue nor leveled a direct charge, presenting solely a highly constricted prompt anchored to evidence visibly displayed. The witness's facial muscles tensed instantly upon hearing the term Tuesday, manifesting a split-second micro-expression practically imperceptible barring trained observation, although the broadcast lenses maintained proper alignment, allowing the court reporter to log the silence preceding her eventual reply. She declared a firm requirement for additional moments to evaluate the highlighted materials, providing a response that initially appeared highly rational, distinctly calibrated, remarkably restrained, and bureaucratically secure. Nevertheless, that specific tactic completely failed to address the rigid chronological progression which had just been formally submitted. The representative refused to press the issue or reiterate his inquiry, opting instead for a significantly more devastating maneuver by grabbing an alternate binder, colored navy, positioning it adjacent to the original to reveal an executive exemption registry spanning 31 pages, originally generated addressing a public records petition submitted 8 months prior. To provide necessary context, the Freedom of Information Act does not represent voluntary transparency. It constitutes a binding statutory mandate forcing government departments to publish archives barring the application of precise exclusionary clauses, with presidential confidentiality serving as one primary shield. The federal law enforcement agency had explicitly announced during January that zero identities contained inside the Epstein dossiers enjoyed protection beneath presidential confidentiality classifications. That official declaration remained highly lucid and entirely unequivocal, deliberately engineered to terminate any further lines of aggressive questioning. The exemption registry clutched in the congressman's grip featured a timestamp exactly 24 hours subsequent, containing 47 distinct redactions justified via executive branch protection, precisely matching the page count found inside the crimson binder. Two separate files entered into sworn testimony sat 12 inches distant from one another, remaining completely official, totally verified, yet logically impossible to concurrently represent factual reality. This exact moment marks the departure from standard congressional proceedings, primarily because the lawmaker declined to pose secondary inquiries or verbally translate the massive discrepancy for the audience. He merely elevated the exemption registry, followed by the agency press release, resting them parallel while absolute quiet accomplished the remaining labor. A pair of journalists remaining beyond the 90-minute threshold ceased their typing, doing so not due to a lack of newsworthy material, but rather because the unfolding events transcended the need for editorial interpretation, becoming glaringly apparent. The Attorney General hoisted the exemption registry before returning it to the desk, squeezing her lower digits together underneath the wooden surface, tightly lacing them at the knuckles, showcasing a subtle bodily reaction that undeniably broadcasts a very particular psychological state emphasizing containment and control under pressure. She shot a quick look toward her lead counsel, who remained entirely stationary, fully aware no brilliant legal retort existed capable of neutralizing the evidence already permanently submitted into the official logs. The committee leader forcefully reiterated her sworn status, an interjection carrying massive significance because whenever declarations occur under penalty of perjury, they depart the realm of partisan theater, entering a rigid judicial framework where spoken words face harsh comparison against physical archives rather than mere political motives. Her vocal pitch stayed perfectly flat, yet the rhythmic delivery shifted noticeably, decelerating her vocabulary, expanding the pauses, and meticulously evaluating every single clause prior to its verbal deployment. The subsequent revelation lacked any presence within prior preparation materials, remained entirely absent from clandestine media drops, and evaded all journalistic previews, principally because the impending disclosure demanded the preceding two items possess established footholds upon the desk. The lawmaker inquired regarding an official federal interview form, noting such a document represents no mere opinion piece. It constitutes the definitive transcript of a bureau interrogation, serving as the paramount asset verifying spoken statements, identifying the speaker, and outlining the surrounding conditions. This mechanism represents exactly how national law enforcement constructs an evidentiary lineage capable of being tracked, authenticated, and eventually submitted before a sitting judge. The specific interrogation transcript under review memorialized a conversation involving a Justice Department executive, executed exactly 7 months preceding the Attorney General's successful Senate approval. Buried within that paperwork sat a direct citation regarding a transmission ledger highlighting 5 distinct interactions bridging a high-ranking agency bureaucrat and an external monetary broker, all occurring entirely during the 21 days immediately predating the controversial secrecy mandate. These 5 separate communications were deliberately withheld throughout the grueling Senate judiciary vetting procedures. The representative rested the interrogation transcript adjacent to both the financial ledger and the exemption registry, resulting in 3 distinct files spanning the furniture, representing 3 detached origin points entirely converging upon the exact same 11-day time frame. He questioned the witness regarding her familiarity with the specific identity belonging to the monetary broker highlighted inside the federal transcript. Once more, she requested supplementary moments to analyze the submitted paperwork, marking the precise instant the rhetorical trap fully constricted, mainly because the interrogator bypassed attacking her cognitive recall, choosing instead to assault the chronological facts. He brandished a 4th piece of evidence constituting a formal delivery acknowledgement featuring a timestamp from 6 weeks prior. Her immediate staff had previously obtained the federal transcript, completely evaluated its contents, and formally certified its arrival. 4 separate files achieved total verification, gaining permanent entry directly into the binding legislative archives. Reaching this juncture, the proceedings ceased focusing upon the witness's mental retention capacity, pivoting entirely toward what the physical archives could definitively demonstrate she had previously witnessed. Furthermore, that crucial differentiation represents the exact boundary where sworn declarations initiate their rapid disintegration. The assembled audience was no longer evaluating a matter of mere forgetfulness. They were witnessing a matter of strict chronological order, and timelines, once firmly cemented, refused to yield to stalling tactics, reject the mitigation of heavily lawyered phrasing, and completely ignore a testifier's desperate pleas for extended review periods. It either withstands scrutiny or guarantees exposure. Moreover, during that specific instance, featuring 4 distinct files marching across the legislative furniture, the timeline remained absolutely unbreakable. Currently, the overarching architecture gains paramount importance since the foundation the Congressman constructed lacked isolated discrepancies, opting instead for an interlocking sequence connecting financial transfers linked to specific calendar days, exemption registries shattering official press releases, federal transcripts verifying hidden communications, and delivery receipts validating previous awareness. Every individual component viewed singularly might succumb to clever rationalization, intense contextual maneuvering, or strategic spin rendering the damage survivable. Combined seamlessly, they manufactured an entirely divergent beast. This precise threshold marked the committee's complete plunge into aggressive prosecutorial territory, regardless of the attendees' willingness to verbally acknowledge the shift, primarily because whenever disparate records unite around one highly constricted time frame, the core investigation abandons establishing past actions, pivoting aggressively toward exposing prior awareness and specific notification dates. Consequently, whenever that specific interrogatory dominates the discussion, any subsequent response transforms into massive legal vulnerability, assuming it contradicts the established archival reality. The interrogator avoided elevating his vocal volume or increasing his speaking velocity. Conversely, he noticeably decelerated, recognizing that rapid progression remains the primary sanctuary for testifiers desperately attempting to bypass damaging revelations. He afforded the audience ample opportunity to visually digest the materials resting prominently upon the forward desks. Following that pause, he plunged his hand back inside the crimson portfolio. The 5th piece of evidence had resided within that enclosure throughout the entire proceeding. He avoided handling it during the initial reveal and neglected mentioning its existence while cementing the groundwork, understanding that pacing within this type of architectural trap ignores artificial rush focusing purely upon delivering inescapable certainty. He extracted the paperwork completely devoid of any introductory fanfare. He deposited it inverted against the wood grain, subsequently pausing for exactly 4 seconds. This duration seems inconsequential during casual banter, yet inside a sworn legislative chamber featuring locked broadcast lenses and defense counsel scrutinizing microscopic twitches, 4-second stretches into infinity, providing adequate space for breathless expectation to morph into crushing weight, allowing the sheer void of data to manifest as undeniable proof. Subsequently, he revealed the front, exposing a routine Justice Department internal approval directive spanning a single sheet containing 3 distinct sections, utterly lacking theatrical styling or blatant indicators capable of telegraphing its massive significance to an untrained observer. However, tucked inside the middle stanza sat an administrative mark highlighting a highly targeted citation regarding docket digits, monetary sums, and a destination bank, with this exact citation harmonizing perfectly alongside the financial ledger previously resting upon the surface. Suddenly, the displayed files transcended mere parallel tracking. They were violently colliding. Resting at the absolute base of that directive sat an endorsement block featuring the Attorney General's explicit surname, lacking any proxy designation, remaining unaffiliated with lower-level staff, and escaping any generic departmental branding to showcase her personal identity alongside her direct mandate and her customized calendar seal. Furthermore, the calendar stamp proved catastrophic because its timeline landed exactly 14 days prior to her formal swearing-in before the Senate Judiciary Committee, an appearance where she articulated plainly, lacking all caveats, that she possessed zero personal connection regarding any fiscal payouts tethered to the Epstein network. Consequently, 2 distinct historical accounts now existed, one delivered verbally under penalty of perjury, the other immortalized via pen strokes, and both items currently rested a mere 12 inches separated across the identical piece of furniture. The congressman declined to physically tap the endorsement line, refusing to verbally emphasize its presence, realizing such actions were superfluous, primarily because whenever evidence achieves formal inclusion into the permanent archives, it demands zero additional commentary to validate its devastating reality. He merely placed the sheet upon the desk, permitting its seamless integration into the devastating chronological chain he had previously manufactured. The witness stared directly at the directive, completely ignoring the interrogator, entirely shunning the surrounding panel, locking her vision exclusively upon the paperwork. Her dominant appendage drifted marginally toward the furniture's boundary before instantly retreating, executing a highly suppressed, aggressively managed, intentional gesture perfectly mirroring the exact physical reflex humans display whenever an overwhelming biological urge to respond gets hijacked by the absolute necessity for intense strategic computation. She refused to elevate the paper, representing a highly consequential choice, mainly because lifting the material would equal active participation, granting it undeniable validity, and accepting the inescapable burden of formulating a coherent defense. Abandoning the item against the desk provided a measure of separation, regardless of how minor or fleeting, yet such physical space fails entirely to alter the permanently etched text. The lawmaker offered zero commentary, deploying no secondary inquiries, providing zero helpful translations, and utilizing absolutely no vocabulary to enforce compliance. He permitted the profound quiet to stretch onward, recognizing that dead air inside such heavily scrutinized chambers never remains vacant. Rather, it gathers immense contextual weight, compelling the target to determine if they should break the tension and exactly what strategy to deploy. The Attorney General's defense counsel attempted to stand, prompting the committee leader to immediately order his compliance, forcing his rapid return to a seated posture. That momentary disruption, highlighting a primal urge to shield the client, exposed a grim reality that spoken dialogue had thus far failed to ratify, a deep internal acknowledgement that the freshly submitted desk materials defied any simple containment strategies, relying upon standard procedural defense tactics. The witness maintained her stare upon the directive for 11 agonizing seconds, a span the court reporter eventually logged, capturing the delay not for theatrical purposes, but simply because the gap proved quantifiable, And within judicial environments, any quantifiable metric serves as a highly lethal weapon during subsequent cross-examinations. 11 uninterrupted seconds devoid of vocalization ticked past, marking an extended window where the sole kinetic energy captured on camera involved the microscopic repositioning of her fingers alongside an unblinking fixation directed straight toward the endorsement block. Following the pause, she vocalized a 5-word defense declaring a complete lack of memory regarding the autograph's creation. Superficially, that specific phrasing demonstrates masterful architectural design as it expertly avoids rejecting the ink's reality, refuses to brand the paperwork a fabrication, entirely dodges allegations of fraudulent reproduction or bureaucratic mistakes, and rigidly confines its entire operational scope to the fallibility of human recollection. Claiming an absence of memory serves as a specialized linguistic tool engineered explicitly to dodge overt paradoxes while simultaneously volunteering zero factual validation. Nevertheless, within a cascading trap resembling this exact scenario, where the central conflict revolves around hard archives rather than cognitive retention, such clever differentiations instantly implode, principally because official logs operate completely independent of a witness's mental acuity. Furthermore, the seasoned representative comprehensively grasped this exact dynamic. He countered by deploying a forward rebuttal asserting the archive's flawless memory. He provided zero extended commentary, avoided dramatic inflections, refused to elevate his volume, and simply executed a stark pivot redirecting attention straight toward the paperwork previously locked inside the permanent registry. Moreover, that precise retort accomplished an instantaneous and permanently unalterable outcome, aggressively transferring the chamber's fundamental focal point far away from spoken narratives and squarely upon the physical archives themselves. Spanning 62 agonizing ticks of the clock, the assembly absorbed that specific interaction, featuring zero vocalizations, absent any rustling stationery, and lacking any desperate maneuvers to alter the trajectory simply because zero viable escape routes remained available. A pair of declarations currently survived in absolute conflict, featuring one broadcast under penalty of perjury and another immortalized inside a verified federal directive, with both variations fully authorized, completely absorbed into legislative history, and fundamentally impossible to coexist as factual reality. This specific threshold dictates the exact moment when an oversight inquiry abandons standard interrogations and morphs into a completely different animal focus purely upon a demonstration. It became an exhibition showcasing the devastating fallout guaranteed whenever bureaucratic procedures, hard files, and merciless chronological sequencing violently intersect to completely obliterate any lingering sanctuary of plausible deniability. This occurred largely because the representative had neglected building a fleeting viral clip, opting instead to erect a sprawling framework where every individual component bolstered the subsequent stage, where every newly introduced file systematically annihilated alternative theories, and where every defensive reply restricted the available escape vectors until merely dual pathways survived, demanding absolute capitulation to the archives or blatant defiance of recorded history. Furthermore, the Attorney General found herself currently paralyzed directly astride that exact terrifying precipice. The subsequent events failed to alleviate this crushing pressure. They merely prolonged the agony. The ensuing developments neglected to cure the pervasive anxiety, they simply amplified its duration. Primarily because whenever a severe paradox successfully embeds itself within the official legislative logs, it refuses to evaporate upon the inquiry's conclusion, choosing instead to aggressively metastasize during every successive reply that desperately fails to repair the shattered narrative. Consequently, that specific dynamic is precisely what initiated during the following barrage of verbal sparring, manifesting not as a sudden detonation nor a catastrophic instantaneous failure, but rather acting as a highly managed disintegration occurring meticulously via each consecutive defensive maneuver. The presiding leader acknowledged the subsequent interrogator, yet the chamber's collective psychological attention refused to pivot alongside the wooden mallet, remaining rigidly tethered to the row of evidence spanning across the prominent wooden surface. 5 distinct artifacts currently sat exposed, every single piece situated strategically, all permanently bound via chronological progression, command signatures, and glaring informational voids. The stark optical display organically morphed into weaponized proof, ensuring any observer scanning the furniture inherently realized a damning truth stood fully validated, regardless of whether any participant possessed the courage to verbally announce the conclusion. Furthermore, this distinct boundary signifies the inquiry's expansion far past the Attorney General as a solitary actor, bleeding outward to infect a significantly wider, distinctly systemic target. This shift happened because the primary mystery abandoned the narrow scope of whether the witness actually endorsed the paperwork, elevating to interrogate precisely how such a directive survived inside a bureaucracy that previously manufactured press releases, exemption registries, and sworn declarations utterly incapable of explaining its existence. Stated differently, the confrontation ceased revolving around one isolated error. It fundamentally challenged whether the massive administrative apparatus generating those identical archives possessed the necessary credibility to internally police its glaring paradoxes. The succeeding barrage of interrogations completely bypassed submitting fresh evidence, realizing such additions were entirely superfluous. Whenever physical proof achieves structurally perfect alignment, prosecutors avoid introducing surplus materials, choosing instead to exert maximum leverage upon the foundation currently deployed. An allied lawmaker pressed the witness regarding whether the federal agency enforced rigid internal oversight protocols governing approval directives linked directly toward monetary payouts, presenting a remarkably basic inquiry appearing bureaucratically harmless upon initial inspection. She responded by declaring that every similar maneuver faithfully adhered to entrenched vetting procedures, while simultaneously demanding clearance through the proper chain of command. Moreover, that specific reply might have proven entirely adequate, assuming the directive resting upon the desk successfully navigated those exact bureaucratic pathways, yet it completely failed to do so. This failure arose primarily because the endorsement adorning the paperwork circumvented any lower-level deputies, escaping all classifications implying proxy power, remaining entirely undiluted and intensely personal. This reality guaranteed that her defensive response, despite maintaining flawless technical accuracy while outlining routine operations, completely failed to rationalize the glaring anomaly currently staring her in the face. This specific methodology perfectly illustrates highly refined prosecutorial leverage deployed flawlessly. Skilled operators avoid leveling accusations and shun loud interruptions, preferring to grant the target ample rope to outline standard operating guidelines before immediately showcasing their catastrophic violation of those exact parameters. A subsequent panelist engaged the target, inquiring whether standard protocols mandated the revelation of any dialogue occurring between high-level agency bureaucrats and outside monetary brokers throughout the grueling Senate vetting processes. This represented yet another dry administrative probe. The Attorney General answered by insisting that every germane revelation was successfully executed while strictly obeying the rigid mandates established by the Senate Judiciary Committee. Furthermore, that secondary defense would have survived intact, barring the existence of the federal transcript previously locked into the permanent archives, highlighting 5 interactions across 21 days involving a singular broker with exactly 0 admissions offered. The overarching schematic stood glaringly obvious to any observer maintaining basic awareness. Every verbal retort painted a picture of bureaucracy operating flawlessly, while every physical file exposed a machine acting with extreme deviance. Consequently, the massive chasm separating those dual universes served as the exact battlefield where the Congressional inquiry currently operated. Having reached this specific stage, the assembled crowd ceased generating any optical responses, abandoning all restless squirming and silencing every background whisper. This behavioral shift occurs because whenever a severe paradox maintains an extended presence, it sheds its initial shock value, morphing rapidly into a foundational pillar of the event. The witness's ensuing replies addressing the subsequent barrage of inquiries adhered to an increasingly restricted trajectory. She repeatedly cited a desperate need to evaluate the files. She claimed total amnesia regarding the granular details of the meetings. She consistently redirected the panel's attention straight toward the internal advisory lawyers. These three specific mantras experienced heavy rotation utilizing minor modifications, with each iteration explicitly engineered to postpone definitive stances, desperately attempting to prevent locking her sworn narrative onto a fixed coordinate susceptible to fatal comparison against the heavily fortified physical archives. Furthermore, when examined entirely within a vacuum, every single one of those defensive maneuvers possesses arguable merit. Human recall proves notoriously fragile. Complex paperwork demands thorough analysis, and advisory attorneys draw salaries for distinct purposes. Nevertheless, when deployed chronologically amidst crushing external strain, flanked by fully verified evidence already absorbed into the permanent logs, those identical defensive tactics inevitably adopt a vastly divergent translation. They rapidly cease projecting an aura of prudent care, adopting instead the distinct acoustic signature of aggressive damage control. This specific juncture represents the exact moment the inquiry violently collided with its ethical core, despite zero attendees possessing the necessary courage to explicitly deploy such highly charged vocabulary. This collision proved inevitable largely because the active stress test extended far beyond the Attorney General's mental retention, aggressively probing the fragile borders separating raw executive power from necessary institutional consequences. Applying a surname to federal directives never functions as mere decorative ceremony. It represents absolute command, signifying the precise second a theoretical debate officially transitions into weaponized deployment. Moreover, whenever that specific endorsement links directly toward monetary payouts tethered closely to secrecy mandates shielding arguably the most intensely investigated criminal dossiers in modern memory, the act violently sheds its bureaucratic camouflage, emerging instantly as deeply historically significant. Currently, take a moment to evaluate the trap's terrifying architecture. The foundation featured a secrecy edict, multiple concealed interactions, a massive fiscal payout approaching $1 million, an exemption registry entirely destroying an official press release, alongside an endorsed directive permanently binding the ultimate command with its final execution. This scenario relies completely upon verified progression, firmly rejecting any reliance upon wild conjecture. Furthermore, rigid timelines universally demand comprehensive justifications immediately upon achieving formal archival status. However, providing a coherent justification requires absolute factual harmony, and such synchronization remained completely impossible because actively forcing the directive to match previous sworn statements mandated confessing personal participation, while fiercely defending the original sworn narrative inherently required denouncing the physical evidence as fraudulent. Navigating either trajectory promised devastating fallout, heavily explaining exactly why the witness remained paralyzed directly amidst the catastrophic crossfire. The committee leader forcefully reiterated the witness's sworn status for a secondary occasion, utilizing the interjection purely to establish undeniable clarity rather than deploying it as a simple aggressive threat. This clarification proved critical because by this specific threshold, the inquiry abandoned all pretenses of merely harvesting new data, pivoting aggressively toward defending the absolute sanctity of the permanent legislative archives. Additionally, those identical archives currently housed 5 distinct files which, once digested as a collective unit, perfectly outlined administrative actions previously hidden from view, a massive fiscal payout lacking any prior justification, alongside a command mandate completely devoid of any prior public confession. Translating this reality beyond the chamber walls requires specific analysis. The situation guarantees the central mystery shatters the boundaries of one isolated session, bleeding aggressively outward to trigger expanded probes, intense institutional audits, and highly probable criminal referrals. This escalation occurs primarily because legislative archives reject serving as mere theatrical props. Their fundamental existence demands relentless subsequent investigation. Furthermore, executing secondary probes within such a heavily regimented apparatus represents a binding bureaucratic mandate rather than a simple voluntary choice. Reaching this specific act, the vast majority of the live audience inherently anticipates a massive surge in theatrical hostility, demanding elevated shouting matches and viciously direct personal attacks. Yet such an explosion completely failed to materialize. largely because injecting uncontrolled emotion during this delicate phase practically guarantees fracturing the meticulously engineered trap. Conversely, the ensuing methodology proved infinitely softer, vastly more disciplined, and substantially harder to successfully dismantle. The concluding verbal sparring gently initiated a descent toward the session's termination, completely lacking any satisfying finality. A panelist aggressively pressed the witness concerning her willingness to fiercely defend her previous sworn declarations delivered before the Senate Judiciary Committee, presenting an incredibly basic, firmly dual-choice prompt. Moreover, during that agonizing instant, the sprawling architectural trap aggressively constricted into one solitary choice, primarily because confirming her past statements guaranteed a fatal collision against the physical directive, while retreating from her earlier claims instantly detonated the credibility of her prior sworn narrative already locked inside the archives. She avoided supplying an instantaneous reply, hesitating not due to any linguistic confusion regarding the prompt's phrasing, but strictly because the ensuing legal shockwaves remained blindingly obvious. She announced a strict requirement to comprehensively evaluate the entire collection of evidence before offering any reaffirmations regarding her previous sworn remarks. Furthermore, that precise defensive maneuver accomplished something incredibly nuanced, yet massively impactful. It aggressively dragged her fundamental posture far away from absolute conviction and firmly into the realm of conditional dependence, abandoning the sanctuary of concrete historical facts in favor of hesitant promises pending future analysis. Moreover, that specific pivot, despite appearing minuscule on the surface, entirely represents the massive gulf separating sworn narratives possessing independent structural integrity from severely compromised declarations heavily relying upon future contextual manipulation to survive. The congressional session rapidly neared its official termination, yet the devastating framework meticulously constructed within those walls refused to die alongside the wooden mallet strike, having merely completed its initial gestation phase. This survival happens because the exact instant a quintet of fully verified files breaches the permanent legislative archives utilizing a singular chronological chain, they aggressively, violently shed their temporary relevance, surrendering their existence entirely to the eternal bureaucracy. Furthermore, that massive administrative apparatus suffers absolutely zero memory loss. The committee leader pivoted toward his concluding monologue, yet the assembled crowd steadfastly refused to decompress. Zero attendees reverted toward the relaxed physical slumping traditionally accompanying the exhaustion of the ultimate interrogatory phase. This lingering tension survived primarily because the devastating architectural trap remained anchored against the wooden furniture, entirely observable, completely lacking resolution, featuring 5 distinct files sharing a solitary chronological path, while totally devoid of any logical narrative capable of binding the pieces safely. Representative Meeks rejected the urge to offer a neat wrap-up, pointedly declining to broadcast a final fiery speech engineered specifically to generate viral news banners. He executed a maneuver bearing infinitely greater historical weight by forcefully submitting the entire quintet of evidence directly into the binding legislative logs, officially designating the materials as the foundational proof demanding intensive secondary probes. That specific phrasing delivered inside that highly charged environment possesses gravity extending far past the physical chamber walls, largely because successfully forcing paperwork into the permanent archives abandons the realm of political theater, achieving absolute historical immortality. It constitutes the aggressive procedure required to permanently fuse raw proof into an unbreakable lineage, ensuring future retrieval, endless citation, and weaponized deployment by alternate investigative panels possessing proper legal authority. Moreover, the exact moment that threshold gets breached, the fundamental mystery evolves, completely abandoning inquiries regarding the session's past events, choosing instead to intensely focus upon the inevitable downstream destruction guaranteed by its existence. The Attorney General's primary legal defender comprehended this dire reality instantaneously. He tilted his torso aggressively toward the desk, altering his physical stance for the initial occasion following the directive's sudden manifestation, executing the movement not to launch a verbal assault nor to register a formal protest, but purely to calculate the impending damage. He understood the crucial window allowing for effective narrative manipulation had slammed permanently shut, leaving only the grim duty of mitigating the catastrophic fallout. The witness steadfastly avoided granting the panel eye contact, absolutely refused to acknowledge the broadcast lenses, and kept her vision locked securely onto the directive, staring fiercely at the identical paperwork, the identical endorsement block, and the identical chronological seal that currently claimed a dual existence upon the physical sheet and deep inside the eternal archives. A massive chasm separates a file simply enjoying temporary physical presence from a file achieving absolute institutional immortality. Fleeting appearances invite aggressive pushback, suffer endless cross-examination, endure intense contextual spin, and succumb to strategic reframing. Eternity rejects all such attacks. Furthermore, that exact unyielding reality represents precisely what the committee successfully cemented into existence. Currently retreats slightly from the granular details, primarily because adopting a wider lens allows the overarching architectural trap's true purpose to shine with blinding clarity. The core conflict consistently transcended any isolated fiscal payout nearing $1 million, reliably ignoring the triviality of solitary directives, singular registries, or lone bureaucratic sheets. The fundamental battleground centered entirely upon absolute synchronization, demanding harmony connecting sworn verbal narratives against hard physical proof, forcing identical messaging between hidden bureaucratic pipelines and external press releases, and requiring a flawless bridge linking raw executive power to inescapable systemic consequences. Moreover, exactly what this specific legislative session proved, utilizing surgical accuracy while completely avoiding cheap dramatic stunts, is the devastating structural collapse guaranteed whenever that crucial synchronization violently shatters. This devastation occurs primarily because whenever the harmony finally snaps, the resulting damage refuses to isolate within a single crack, opting instead to expose massive systemic fatigue tearing completely across the surrounding framework. An exemption registry actively destroying an official press release transcends a mere public relations nightmare. It fundamentally represents a catastrophic failure of institutional archiving. A federal transcript verifying hidden interactions extends far past a simple memory lapse. It signifies a massive breach of mandatory transparency protocols. An endorsed directive directly warning against statements delivered under penalty of perjury completely abandons the realm of innocent errors, morphing instantly into a terminal crisis of fundamental trustworthiness. Furthermore, whenever that unholy trinity of failures concurrently shares a physical space, firmly anchored to an identical chronological path, they aggressively shed their status as lone anomalies, rapidly congealing into a weaponized behavioral trend. Currently, take a moment to evaluate the grim realities that specific behavioral trend projects far beyond the heavily guarded doors protecting the legislative chamber. It explicitly highlights a sprawling bureaucracy actively executing massive commands, meticulously logging the actions, and subsequently deploying wildly divergent explanations strictly tailored to pacify specific demographic targets. It illuminates a terrifying void separating hidden administrative gears from sanitized public marketing. Moreover, that specific darkened void serves as the exact breeding ground where institutional faith initiates its rapid decay. This erosion happens largely because ordinary citizens lack the access required to handle classified internal directives, leaving them entirely reliant upon engaging with curated press releases. Consequently, whenever those polished declarations violently clash against the hard archives, the central mystery instantly abandons the hunt for the original decision-maker, pivoting to interrogate whether the massive apparatus generating the conflicting data retains any shred of basic reliability. This specific challenge entirely bypasses tribal political warfare, actively refusing to focus upon singular presidential eras, isolated agency directors, or fleeting historical chapters. It fundamentally probes whether the identical regulatory framework aggressively enforces compliance evenly across the absolute highest tiers of executive power. This concern remains valid because assuming an endorsement resting upon a file survives entirely devoid of public confession, assuming massive fiscal payouts proceed lacking any coherent justification delivered to the taxpayers, And assuming a cluster of interactions easily evades detection throughout a grueling Senate vetting procedure, then the bureaucracy has completely abandoned operating with genuine transparency, choosing instead to function via highly selective concealment. Furthermore, deploying heavily filtered transparency completely invalidates the core concept of openness. It merely represents another sophisticated mechanism for maintaining absolute authoritarian grip. Currently, transport your attention back inside the legislative chamber for a final review. The wooden mallet strikes the desk, generating an incredibly crisp, highly definitive acoustic snap signaling procedural closure, yet absolutely zero elements preceding the noise project any aura of genuine resolution. The defense lawyers commence harvesting their scattered evidence, aggressively piling the loose sheets and firmly sealing the binders, executing entirely mundane physical chores. However, the Attorney General entirely rejects the impulse to urgently flee, anchoring herself to the chair for a distinctly unnatural duration, keeping her vision rigidly locked upon the wooden surface, endlessly staring down the devastating paperwork. This paralysis stems largely from her internal realization that during this specific window, the massive gulf separating a dignified exit from a catastrophic retreat relies entirely upon anticipating the impending shockwaves rather than dwelling upon the recent carnage. Her primary legal defender stretches across the gap, snatches the disputed directive, and firmly buries it deep inside a secure portfolio. Yet the identical duplicate permanently fused into the legislative archives adamantly refuses to budge, entirely declining to exit the chamber, aggressively resisting all attempts at secure transport, ensuring it simply remains forever. Moreover, that specific archival iteration represents the sole variation retaining any actual power, surviving as the definitive master copy awaiting relentless evaluation, endless quotation, aggressive cross-referencing, and vicious interrogation launched by rival panels, independent auditors, and any regulatory bureau possessing the legal mandate to ruthlessly chase the evidentiary trail downstream. The 4 dozen distinct redactions hidden inside the exemption registry maintain their stubborn existence. The quintet of interactions spanning the 21-day gap remain fully memorialized. The fiscal ledger stubbornly projects its calendar stamp, its destination digits, and its command endorsement, while the internal directive continues displaying an autograph completely lacking any logical harmony alongside previous declarations delivered under penalty of perjury. The entire devastating collection currently survives localized entirely within a singular, highly guarded vault, abandoning its previous status as scattered rumors or wild political theories, achieving the terrifying reality of a permanent historical archive. Consequently, we arrive at the ultimate lingering inquiry, the exact mystery successfully evading a comprehensive resolution inside those specific walls while remaining completely inescapable across the broader political landscape. Assuming the physical archives and the spoken sworn narratives logically preclude one another from occupying factual reality simultaneously, precisely which variation is the massive bureaucratic apparatus currently willing to fiercely defend using its absolute institutional weight? This specific dilemma completely bypasses superficial public relations management, plunging straight into the core of fundamental trustworthiness. And whenever foundational honor suffers a stress test of this extreme magnitude, it entirely loses the ability to passively regenerate. The system either withstands the relentless pressure of intense auditing, or it eventually mandates a massive internal realignment. And whenever heavily fortified bureaucracies initiate such drastic course corrections, they inevitably generate an entirely fresh, highly visible evidentiary wake. Therefore, the impending act within this sprawling saga completely guarantees its absence from flashy news banners, ensuring its eventual authorship via aggressive secondary subpoenas, forced supplementary transparency dumps, and the ultimate determination regarding whether that specific quintet of files successfully sparks the exact caliber of devastating audit they were originally submitted to incite. This grinding, relentless process perfectly illustrates the actual mechanics of institutional consequences operating at peak efficiency, proving the true power rarely manifests during the initial explosive reveal, relying instead completely upon the massive downstream destruction generated by the original blast. Consequently, the ultimate burden immediately transfers, aggressively abandoning the heavily scrutinized testifier, completely bypassing the aggressive lawmaker launching the interrogatories and settling firmly upon the massive administrative apparatus currently guarding the permanent archives. Will the agency follow the evidentiary trail wherever it leads? Will it forcefully harmonize the conflicting evidence placed side by side? Will it apply the identical legal standard to the elite that it applies everywhere else? Or will those 5 files become just another archived entry that nobody is mandated to investigate? This query completely lacks any theoretical softness. It represents the ultimate existential challenge, and the eventual reply completely guarantees whether the carnage witnessed inside the chamber fades as a fleeting theatrical stunt or successfully ignites a massive, inescapable, and highly punitive historical reckoning. Assuming you fiercely maintain that official archives mirroring this exact explosive nature demand significantly more than mere passive existence, strongly requiring aggressive institutional retaliation, then you absolutely cannot permit the momentum to die right now. Hit the like button to expand the algorithm's reach. Comment your thoughts regarding the next necessary step. Share this breakdown with anyone who still assumes hearings finish when the cameras shut off, and subscribe.